Good evening, everyone. Thank you to our fourth Listen and Learn session. This evening, Senator Jeff Irwin will be describing the job of the Michigan senator. Thank you, Jeff, for participating and welcome.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you to you and IPSA Can I Share for all the work you're doing to try to get what's happening in Lansing out to communities, because there are a lot of important decisions being made in Lansing that affect the future of where we live. And so my name is Jeff Irwin. As Gail mentioned, I'm the state senator for the 14th district. So I have the honor to serve about 290,000 people who live in the Ypsilanti area, all the way down US 12 to Tecumseh. So the southern half of Ann Arbor, Saline, Milan, Manchester, Tecumseh, Clinton, all those communities are in the district that I have the honor to serve. And I'm just starting my second term in the Michigan State Senate. And Gail asked me to come and just talk a little bit about what we do, what are some of the important things we're talking about, but also just to start off with just a really kind of basic description of the structure of state government and where that state senate fits into that. So, just very briefly, the Michigan state government very much mirrors what you see on the federal level. But unlike in DC, where there's a president, in Lansing, of course, we have a governor, and that's Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And just like the U.S. Constitution sets the rules for what Congress can do and what kind of laws they can pass and what kind of rights are reserved to the people, the Michigan Constitution similarly sets the rules for how the legislature has to operate and how we make new ideas into laws, or how we pass budgets that fund the priorities that our citizens have. Along the same lines, just like Congress has a House of Representatives and a Senate, we have the same structure in Lansing. We have a House of Representatives with 110 members, and we have a state Senate with 38 members. As I mentioned earlier, each state senator represents roughly 280, 290,000 people, and there are 38 of them. In Michigan, we have about 10 million people. And then on the state house side, there are 110 state reps. Each one represents about 90,000 people in each district. So that gives you some idea of the kind of scale, that we're working with our office when we're trying to answer people's questions and, work on the various ideas that are important to our communities. One of the big differences, though, that I'll mention between the federal level and the state level is that at the federal level, the members of the House of Representatives, our member of the House of Representatives is Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, but the members of the House of Representatives are based on districts of equal size all across the country. So in general, they represent the population in a proportional way. In the U.S. Senate, as I'm sure folks know, there's 2 U.S. senators for each state. And this was all based on the great compromise that was developed way back at the start of the U.S. Constitution, where smaller, more rural places were worried that they were going to get outvoted by some of the big population states at the time. We say, for instance, New York. And so they made this deal to give rural areas more representation than was proportionally appropriate or called for if you were just to do it just like we do in the House of Representatives. We don't have a great compromise in the state Senate. State Senate districts are proportional based on population, just like the House of Representatives districts are. They're just larger because there are fewer state senators. It used to be that our districts were drawn every 10 years after the census, just like they're drawn for Congress by the legislature. But because of a constitutional amendment that passed in 2018, we now have a nonpartisan citizens commission that draws the districts for the state Senate and the state House. So, that's how the system is broadly set up. And, once the elections are over and legislators are sworn in early in January, one of the first things that happens is that we are assigned committees by our leaders. There's a leader elected within each chamber. So in the Senate, there's a Senate Majority Leader, and in the House, there's a Speaker of the House. In the Senate where I work, it's Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks. In the House, she's from Grand Rapids. In the House, it's Speaker Joe Tate. He's from Detroit. And so once the leadership is elected, those individuals, with consultation with the members, assign us all to various committees, and the committees are structured to try to cover the various issues that the legislature has to deal with. I am currently assigned to serve on the Appropriations Committee. That's the committee where we set the budget. And within that Appropriations Committee, there are a number of subcommittees. And I'm chairing the subcommittee on environment, Great Lakes, and energy. So in other words, I set the agenda for that meeting. And I'm also participating in the biggest budget, I would argue, possibly the most important budget in the state government, which is the Health and Human Services budget. I'm also on the University and Community Colleges subcommittee, and I'm also on the Corrections and Judiciary subcommittees. In addition to that, I'm also on some policy committees where we discuss new laws or proposals for new laws. I'm the chair of the Housing and Human Services Committee. That's where we're dealing with issues like, what are we going to do about this affordable housing crisis that's been a problem in our communities here in Michigan for a long time and just continues to make it harder for people to get by, and it makes it harder for people to find, jobs and homes near their jobs, and make that whole economic system work better. So affordable housing, but then also human services. So this is where we deal with what are the rules for Medicaid in our state, and eligibility around other types of assistance, whether that's emergency assistance or energy assistance or food assistance. All those kinds of items would likely come to the Housing and Human Services Committee. I'm also on the Civil Rights, Judiciary, and Public Safety Committee. That's where we recently heard legislation on expanding our civil rights law to include LGBTQ people, but it's also where we hear all the kinds of issues around police accountability, which is something I've been very involved in over the years, criminal justice reform. Also usually gets assigned to that committee. And then also sort of civil justice issues, things like negligence, or, if there's a slip and fall accident, what are the rules for how those cases get brought to court, and standards of proof and eligibility for recompense and all that kind of judiciary related stuff. I also serve on the Insurance, Financial Services, and Consumer Protection Committee. So that's where we might be talking about auto insurance. We might be talking about things like, I'm certainly interested in talking about things like trying to curtail the abuses in the payday lending space, and just trying to make sure that when people are interacting with banks and credit unions and other types of financial service industry businesses, that they're treated fairly and that we have better consumer protection laws in Michigan. So those are some of the assignments, the official assignments I have in the legislature. But of course, as a member of the legislature representing the 14th district, my responsibilities fall into two main buckets. One is writing laws, making new rules for the state of Michigan. And then also stipulating sort of what are the punishments if you run afoul of those rules. That's all sort of in bucket one. And then bucket two is how are we going to spend the people's money? The state of Michigan, brings in tax revenue from sales tax, income tax, gas tax, various excise taxes, property tax. How are we going to spend those dollars? And also, how are we going to spend the dollars that the federal government sends to the state to administer some of the federal programs here in our state? The big ones would be Medicaid or workforce development programs. So anyway, there's also, of course, some federal money that comes in for roads. And so we have to write a budget that assigns those dollars to those various areas. So when we think about bucket one, making new rules for our state, the way it basically works is that, if you've seen the old Schoolhouse Rock cartoon where they sing the song of "I'm a Bill, I'm just a Bill, and I'm stuck here in Capitol Hill," it's basically just like that. As legislators, we have the opportunity to work with a group of lawyers in Lansing called the Legislative Service Bureau. In fact, we're obligated to work with them to write our bills. And, we can bring them an idea or maybe even a fully written law, and, work with those attorneys to make sure that the idea is crafted and written down in such a way where it connects appropriately to all the other laws in Michigan, and so that it will work. At that point, once you've got that idea developed and you think it's ready to go, you can introduce that piece of legislation. And when it's introduced, it goes to the Secretary of the Senate, and the Secretary of the Senate is going to enroll that bill, which gets it onto the state's computer system and officially gets the bill introduced. But then the first most important thing that happens with that idea or that bill is that it will be assigned to a committee. And that decision is ultimately made by, in the Senate Majority Leader. So Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks will decide where to send that bill. Oftentimes bills are sent to, where they would be appropriate to. As I mentioned earlier, if it's an insurance bill, it usually goes to insurance. Once that bill is sent to that committee, it is under the sole discretion of the chair of that committee whether or not to have a hearing on the bill and whether or not to vote on the bill. Now, there's an exception to that. A bill can be discharged from committee if the majority of the legislature wants to do that. But that only happens in fairly rare circumstances when everybody wants to override the decision of a chair. It's just not typical, but it does happen. If the bill is then reported from the committee, a majority of the members on that committee vote to say, yes, I want to pass this bill, and yes, I want to send it to the floor of the Senate. Then the bill goes to the floor of the Senate, and it sits there until the Senate Majority Leader, at their sole discretion, decides to have that bill voted on. Now, once again, there's an exception to that. If a majority of the body says, no, we want to hear the bill anyway, they can do that. But given the way that a majority leader is elected, it has to be elected by the majority, it's very rare that the majority is then going to oppose the decision of their elected leader. They have to kind of go back on who it was they elected. And so you don't see that very often. And in fact, in 10 years in the legislature, I've never seen that kind of decision by a majority leader or a speaker get overridden. That's essentially how it's done. Bills get introduced, they get sent to committee. If they make it through the committee, they get to the floor. If they pass with a majority of members supporting, then that goes over to the other chamber. And in order for that bill to make it all the way to the governor's desk, to make it to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's desk, the exact same language has to pass in the House and the Senate. And so if the Senate passes that bill and kicks it over to the House, the same process starts all over. It goes to the clerk. The clerk is going to send it to a committee. The committee's got to vote for it. Then it comes to the floor. Then the whole body has to vote for it. And once again, if both sides agree on identical language, then it can go to the governor. If one side agrees to a bill, but then it goes over to the other side and there's a change made, they make an amendment to the bill, well, that amendment has to come back over and be agreed on again in the initial House. Sometimes bills will ping pong back and forth as both sides make small changes, and it sort of winds its way towards agreement. In rare circumstances, bills are assigned to conference committees, which is just another way to sort of resolve those differences. If the leaders decide they don't want to ping pong a bill because there are too many little changes to make, they can assign a new committee to hear just that bill and just decide on those changes. And then that final version is presented to both sides, and both sides have to agree again in order for it to get to the governor. Then the governor has to agree and sign that bill. Or if the governor vetoes the bill, it can be overridden by a 2/3 majority in the House and Senate. That's also something I've never seen happen in my time in the legislature. So that's kind of the one bucket, a new idea, a new law. The other bucket is budgets. How do we spend the state's money? Just to give you an idea of the gravity of the state's sort of involvement is that, our budget this year, the governor's proposed budget was $79 billion. So the state of Michigan is going to spend roughly $79 billion a year going forward, and that will probably increase as, inflation and the time value of money changes. The state is going to spend roughly $80 billion next year as proposed by the governor. And so that's really how I mentioned the governor's proposal. That's how the budget process starts. The governor proposes, and the legislature disposes. And so usually early in the year, this year it happened in February, often it happens sort of end of February, early March, the governor will propose their executive budget recommendation. So they present a document to the legislature that says, here is how I would like to have my departments resourced to, fund our schools, fund our roads, fund our healthcare services, fund our prisons, fund our environmental protection programs, all the things that the state government does, including all of the internal services that folks don't often think about, like the Treasury Department, like for instance, the fact that the Attorney General and the Secretary of State have budgets that need to be funded. The legislature itself has a budget. The governor's office has a budget. We've got a Department of Technology Management and Budget that does purchasing for the state and things like that. So all those kinds of things, servicing the state's facilities, all that stuff is all in the governor's budget recommendation. Then what happens is the legislature takes that budget recommendation and produces budget bills. In the past, the way it would work would be the legislature would pass a budget just for K-12 appropriations, just for universities and community colleges, and those would wind their way through the process. What started happening in recent years, really during the Snyder administration, is that the legislature has been passing those individual budgets, but then at the end of the process, they roll them up into two big budgets, one omnibus general fund budget bill and one school aid fund budget bill. The reason why they did that under the Snyder administration was because the Republicans had total control of state government. And frankly, I think that the governor and the members of the legislative leadership wanted to roll those all up into one big vote to make it easier to pass and make it harder for some of their members to nitpick the items in one budget or another. If you can't tell, I don't particularly like this new tradition of rolling the budgets up because I like it when legislators have more of an opportunity to say, well, wait a second, why are we doing that exactly, that piece, that little piece there in our prisons? Or, hey, maybe this small thing that's in the school aid budget is something I want to make a point about and make an amendment about. It's harder to do that when it's all rolled up into, big chunks and, tens of billions of dollars at a time. Anyway, that's been the practice recently. But a budget bill works essentially just like any other bill. It starts in one chamber or another. Both chambers have to agree and pass the exact same budget, and then it goes up to the governor's desk. There are a couple different differences, though, about budget bills. One is that the key one is that the governor has a line item veto in Michigan. You might have heard about the line item veto. So in Michigan, what a governor can do is rather than just veto the whole bill, which would start the whole process over or require the legislature to consider overriding, instead, the governor can just line item veto, meaning that if you look at the budget bill, it's going to have hundreds, probably thousands of lines. So, so for instance, just within the Health and Human Services budget, there'll be a line item for, services to the aged. And that might have money in it for senior centers. It might have money in it for the Area Agency on Aging. It might have money in it for the PACE programs that serve some of our seniors. It might have money in it for home help programs. Each one of those is going to be a line. And in fact, some of those might have multiple lines within them. And so how the legislature structures its budget, how it structures those lines can sometimes be relevant because the governor can come along and say, I want to approve this whole budget except this item or except that item. The governor can't add new items. The governor can't amend the items, but that line item veto does make it very different than what you see with normal policy bills when you're proposing a new rule. So that's kind of the broad description of how it works. Right now, where we are right now in the process is that with respect to policy bills, those get started at the beginning of the year. There are no bills introduced at the beginning of the year. So where we are right now is we're starting to see some of the first bills get to the governor's desk. At the beginning of the year this year, Democrats having the majority for the first time in 40 years. It's been since 1983. Since Democrats have controlled the Michigan legislature. So given that, we, as a group decided that there was going to be some major priorities, and we've sent those major priority bills to the governor's desk already. And those included a tax reduction for retirees, that we got rid of the Republican retirement tax, which is about 12 years old now, and basically said that a broad swath of retirement income is not going to be taxable. That's going to save your average seniors maybe $1,000 a year. We increase the earned income tax credit. So that's relevant to low income workers. If you're eligible for the federal earned income tax credit, then you're eligible for the state earned income tax credit. And we basically tripled the value of that. It was 6% of the federal credit. Now it's going to be 30%. Oh, so my math is wrong. I'm sorry. We multiplied it by 5 times. And so that's going to save your average low income family maybe $500 a year additional and give them additional credit. We also restored some labor protections. We eliminated the law that basically said that unions couldn't have agency fees, couldn't have a contract that required the people benefiting from the contract to cover the cost of the union's bargaining and grievance policies. You might hear people talking about this forces people to join a union. That's not really what it does. Federal law prohibits anyone from being forced to join a union, but this would allow contracts that would require people to pay a fair share of just the bargaining and grievance costs that unions incur when they're voted into a workplace. We also restored prevailing wage, which is a law that requires projects that are being built by the state to pay a prevailing wage, which is, ultimately the same, which is kind of like a union wage here in the state of Michigan. We also passed that bill I mentioned earlier and had the governor sign, which extends our Elliott Larson civil rights law to LGBTQ people. What that basically means is that if someone is outwardly discriminated for their sexual orientation and they're fired from their job, or a landlord refuses to rent to them, or a realtor refuses to sell to them just because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, then that would be now illegal in Michigan. A lot of people thought that was illegal already, but that had been a long-standing wrong that in my opinion, we righted. I was proud to vote for that bill. We also passed some gun safety bills. The ones that are on the governor's desk right now are universal background check and a safe storage law that basically says that if you don't secure your weapons properly and you've got kids in your home and they acquire your weapons and they commit crimes with your weapons, well, then you can be held accountable for that. And then finally, we also eliminated the old 1931 law that criminalized abortion. The citizens voted on that last fall. We wanted to get that off the books so that no creative judges could come along later and try to punish people for exercising the rights that we just voted for in the state constitution. But there are other bills that are just starting to get going now too. It takes a little while for them to get assigned to committee and make it through the process. I've got a couple of bills that are out of the Senate and over into the House right now. One that eliminates the asset test for food stamps. During the Snyder administration, they adopted a law that said that, if you had assets in the bank, that you weren't eligible for food stamps. They initially set that limit pretty low, and it was disqualifying a lot of people. And one of the first things that Governor Whitmer did when she got into office was she raised the asset test to $15,000, and that's affecting almost no one. There aren't people who are typically applying for food stamps with $15,000 sitting in the bank. But even though the governor raised that limit so that it didn't really affect folks, I wanted to once again get that law off the books so that we wouldn't have some, Scrooge-minded Republican or some other party governor coming along in the future and saying, let's ratchet that down again and make it harder for people to get food assistance. My view is that food assistance is frontline, the first level, most easy level of assistance to get. It's 100% federally funded. The federal government pays the bills, and they already have eligibility requirements. If you're low income, you should be able to get food stamps. If you lose your job, and you've run into temporary hard times, I think you should be able to access those benefits. And hopefully the House agrees with me and we can get that bill on the governor's desk. Now, I also passed another bill about assistance for families that take on guardianships. We have something in Michigan called the Guardianship Assistance Program that allows parents who make a permanent home for kids coming out of the foster care system, to get some assistance for that if they're eligible. But when the law was written, it was written in a way that frankly discriminated against tribal communities because it excluded guardianships that were ordered by tribal courts. So we passed a bill to add tribal courts into that and make those families eligible for the same sort of assistance as they would be if their guardianship was granted through a state court. So that's kind of my broad description of how the process works. Hopefully that was what you were looking for, Gail. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, but I also just want to say that, at the state level, we're making decisions that I think personally are the most important decisions to the future of our communities. Are we going to have quality schools in every zip code? Are we going to rebuild a mental health system that keeps people safe and that helps people when they're struggling? Are we going to make sure that everyone has access to doctors when they get sick? Are we going to have roads that don't destroy your car and frankly, a functional transportation system that's not just about cars, but also provides people opportunities to get where they need to go, whether it's church or work or a doctor's appointment via transit, public transit? That's one of the big missing parts in our Southeast Michigan area that not just that holds back individual people and that also holds back our economy. Are we going to have a clean environment with clean air and water? Are we going to attend to the needs not just of people who are here now, but the people who are going to come here in the future and who are also going to need clean air and clean water then? Or do we have, a corrections system that is all fair? Are we attending to the needs of the people who've become part of the criminal justice system? So all these things are important issues, and I just think it's an incredible honor and responsibility to be able to work on these issues that are just critical to the future of our communities. So thanks, and hopefully you've got some questions for me.
I have several. Should I take them one at a time?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first question I have is, how can we find who votes which way on each bill that's in the Senate?
Sure, absolutely. So the Michigan legislature has what I think is a pretty good website. It's kind of Spartan. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles, but I think it works pretty well. So you can get there. I don't know if maybe Annie would be willing to put it in the chat, but it's I think it's legislature.mi.gov. I think you can also get there with michiganlegislature.org. And so if you go there, you can plug in any bill number and it'll tell you, it'll bring up a page that has, what the bill says. Oftentimes you can find an analysis of the bill there, which can be really helpful as well. Bills usually only get an analysis though if they're going to be considered. And then you can also get the whole history of the bill, whether it's moved through committee or not. That's all kind of on that page. What you can also do on that page is when you look at the history, you can also pull up the journal. The journal, the Senate journal and the House journal are the official record of every day in the legislature. So, you can use the website and use the tools on the website to kind of just, well, where is this bill? Who's moving? How many people voted for it or not? But you can also go directly to that journal and see each of the names of who voted for what. And if anybody is particularly interested in getting information about a bill, you can also write your legislator. If you're struggling to use the website, if you can't figure out how to find the journal entry that you're looking for, you can also ask our office. And this is one of the things I didn't say in my initial my initial presentation, but I think a lot of focus is put on the fact that, we can pass laws and we can vote for or against bills and we debate them in committee and we make speeches about these issues and all of that. But another thing that our office does that's really important, I always try to mention this at all my town halls and coffee hours, is that we can also just answer your questions. If you have a very specific question about a bill or an idea, or you're wondering, why you're getting this crazy letter from unemployment, you can reach out to us and we'll do our best to help you navigate the systems of state government and get your questions answered.
Thank you. So when the first thing you said was a bill number, and when I'm thinking about a person searching for the first time, if you're just looking to see, to explore, how would the average person even know a bill number
Yep.
So I'm saying, speak to me as a kindergartner, and how would you navigate the system in a simplistic way?
Yeah, there are two answers to that, and neither of them are 100% effective. But when you're there on the website, you can put in keywords and you can do a keyword search. So you can say, hey, you know, what are the bills on the environment, or what are the bills on education, or you can get even more specific than that. But that's all based on how well the bills have been indexed in the system. And so it works pretty well. You know, if you're looking for education bills, you can bring up a list of them, but there might be more, you know, and you might have to pour through a number of them to find the one you want. But if you're just kind of browsing around, that certainly works. And you can search by, you know, general content. The other thing you can do on there that is pretty cool is you can sign up for RSS feeds as well. That means that, like, you can say, there's a little spot where you can say, yeah, send me an email whenever a bill gets introduced with this keyword. So you can put in there, say education, for instance, and they'll send you an email with a link to the bill every time a bill gets introduced that deals with education. So similarly to the other idea, it depends somewhat on how well the bill was indexed, and sometimes a bill could maybe be described a lot of different ways. So it's not perfect, but that's, you know, that's the best answer I can give you about sort of if you're just kind of going on there and interested in learning, hey, what's going on with transit, or what's going on with you know, food assistance. You know, you could plug that in, and it'll spit out you know, what's been indexed under that code, under that term.
Okay. Next question, and then I'll defer to the next hand. Because COVID is still present and food prices are going up, in March, that's when they eliminated the subsidies that COVID offered to families that were struggling. How do we address those families that still have long-term illnesses and still need subsidies?
Yeah, there's been a couple different ideas proposed. One of them is just to have the state pick up the, you know, pick up the freight for those enhanced food benefits. You know, if memory serves, I think that would cost the state like $1.2 billion a year. And that's been something that some folks have proposed putting into the budget. Of course, you know, there's an opportunity cost to that. Do we want to do that, or do we want to, you know, do some of the other things that other people are proposing? And that's going to be something that we're going to work out as a legislature between now and probably June. That's hopefully when we're going to pass the budget, because the state's fiscal year starts on October 1st. You know, the other approach that some people have proposed, you know, because of course, if we do it that way, the cliff gets moved further away. And, you know, unless the state's just going to continue doing that into perpetuity. The other idea that some folks have proposed is, let's identify certain subpopulations that are most in need within that group, and, you know, try to fund enhanced benefits for those groups going forward. So whether that would be people with a long-term disability from COVID, or maybe people who meet a certain income thresholds, you know, so those are the ideas that are being tossed around right now. And in order for any of those ideas to become part of the law or become part of the budget, they would have to, you know, get 20 votes in the Senate and 56 votes in the House, and the governor's approval, all within that budget document that, like I said, hopefully will be passing in within a couple months.
Of course, I'll have one more comment on that. How do we know, for people of color especially, that and economically disadvantaged people, how would we know who's suffering the most? How do you make that determination to say there's a certain group of people that have suffered the most? Things were cut off, extra benefits. So how do we carry those people from going down further while we're waiting for legislators to then vote on covering those people?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a couple of things. One, I mean, the legislature could act more quickly. I mean, we always have the opportunity to pass a supplemental budget and to, move that decision ahead of all the other decisions in the budget. That's certainly possible, and that would require getting, once again, the same majority as before. When trying to answer your question about sort of how does that determination get made, it gets made in a variety of ways, but ultimately the determination has to be made with that same 20 votes in the Senate, 56 in the House, and 1 governor. Now, it gets a little deeper than that, of course, though, because all these decisions, have influence from the outside, from the voters, from interest groups. So, for instance, right now, the Michigan League for Public Policy, for instance, is one group that comes forward and usually highlights these types of what I would call broadly like human services issues, like programs that affect people in need. We'll hear from groups like the United Ways often are coming forward and advocating for these kinds of changes. Maybe a group like AARP or that, so sometimes we'll hear from interest groups that are coming from the outside saying, hey, this federal program is ending. You need to act to, fill that need in this way. And once again, that butts up against, all the other, groups who are out there saying that, we need to enhance services to seniors, or groups who are out there saying, whatever else is being proposed.
I'll let someone else answer questions and then I'll.
Awesome. I think PC had his hand raised.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, quite a few questions, and one of the things that you had talked about earlier, Jeff, is that there is a website that you can look at where you can see if there's any type of bills that has been worked on. By myself being disabled, that will be a little challenging. So is there a way that people with disabilities can have access to finding out that type of help to help assist looking at if there's any type of bills that's out there that a person like me have ideas that may benefit the community, that can be an inspired bill that could possibly be out there?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So answer one is that, as I suggested earlier, you could also just, write our office and say, hey, I want to learn more about this particular topic, what's being done on it, or I have an idea. My idea is XYZ. What do you think? Or, how can I learn more about other folks who are talking about this same idea? All of that's possible. And then I would say, in addition to that, that there's, of course, interest groups out there who might be able to provide you more information. So, for instance, let's say you wanted particularly to know about what is being done for groups, say the deaf community. You could reach out to groups that advocate in that space. You could also reach out to the Department of Civil Rights that has a unit that specifically focuses on that. So it's different for every, every question you have. If you wanted to learn more about campaign finance reform, you could write our office, but you could also write groups that work on campaign finance reform, like the Michigan Campaign Finance Reform Network. Those are the best suggestions I have for you.
Okay, my next one is that I don't know if you are aware of it or if anybody is aware of it, but the little liquor bottles, the shot glass bottles that they sell at the stores, they have a 10-cent deposit on it, but none of the stores accept those to be returned. How do we try to figure out that solution? Because that's possibly hundreds of dollars just going into the landfills without properly returning those. And that's been going on for about 2 years now.
That's interesting. I don't know about that. My understanding is that those bottles don't have a deposit on them. So I don't know. We're going to have to look into it. We can try to get back to you on that issue because I don't think that those are covered, but I might be wrong. That happens a lot, right? There's a lot of laws. So we'd have to look specifically into the bottle bill for you, find out exactly what the rule is. If the law says that if they sell an item and sell it and sell an item to you with a deposit, they're required to take it with certain exceptions. So it sounds to me like, maybe there are some retailers who are charging deposits on things they shouldn't be, which is possible. If that's the case, I'd really like to know about that and explore this issue and maybe work with the Attorney General's office on enforcing against that if indeed my sense of the situation is correct. But I'd want to double check on that and make sure that my recollection of exactly where that law extends is exactly correct.
Okay, and one more. How to make a past existing village or a city a historic status?
So there's a law that covers how that's done. And ultimately the decision is up to the local government. I don't know all the details of it. If you were to write my office, we could, send you to some primers and walkthroughs. But, essentially the process is that a group of people have to propose the historic district to be created, and then the local government has to authorize that. And so, that's it in a nutshell, but there are more details than that on exactly, there's probably a petition process with how many people have to get on board to make that request. I'm sure that the local government has to have various public hearings on the issue before they vote on it. But that's essentially the broad outlines, and like with everything else, if you wanted to explore this more, we'd be happy to direct you to the law and sort of show you, some examples of how it's been done in the past, because there are communities in our area that have historic district commissions, but they're all locally authorized ultimately.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess it's back to me with questions. No
Sounds
one
good.
else.
I could throw out a few just to kill, like maybe
Oh, well,
they're,
let's get
they're
Gail's first.
basic. Oh, do you have another question, Gail?
Of course.
Oh yeah, you go ahead. I was just gonna throw one in to kill
Okay.
time.
The way you describe things for a person that doesn't know how to maneuver through the system, it sounds to me very difficult for a first timer just trying to find out how do we learn about this for those who knew nothing, but they would like to know, number one, who is their senator? Is their senator voting in their best interest? So there's more questions that have, popped up, thinking someone who wants to get involved, who wants to know who their senator is, what if no one calls them? What if they don't feel comfortable writing to them because they don't know how to ask for a specific thing? So how can we make things a little more simplified, or were they difficult on purpose?
Yeah, I don't know about that last point, but certainly, I'll go back to saying a couple things. One, there are a lot of groups out there that are formed to accomplish different things. So for instance, big kudos to Ipsy Can I Share for, just trying to get this information out there and trying to equip people with more information about how their government works. There are other organizations like League of Women Voters and others that kind of do similar things, but it's important that you're doing this kind of work. So that's why I'm happy to participate with you and do what I can to try to get the word out. That's why I have town halls and coffee hours. That's why I try to get out to various events in the community so folks can just understand that, hey, I'm a guy who lives in the area near Packard and Platt. I work for you. If you've got questions, I'm happy to try to answer them the best I can. And, we're all in this together. Because demystifying the process and trying to get more people involved is important to me, and I appreciate that it's important to you, and I appreciate what you're trying to do with this event and with Ipsy Can I Share in general. There are also other interest groups out there that might have a lot more information about your particular interest and how legislators are engaging with your particular interest. So for instance, I used to work for an organization called the League of Conservation Voters. That organization is all about promoting clean air and clean water and livable communities. And they annually produce a scorecard on the Michigan legislature. And their national affiliate produces a scorecard on Congress. So if you want to know what the sort of environmental score of your legislator is, That's a pretty good document that you can pick up and look at, and it's pretty user friendly. Sierra Club does a similar thing. Clean Water Action, I think, has a scorecard as well. And a lot of other organizations are starting to adopt that approach of trying to boil things down into a simple, digestible scorecard. Having said that, though, I would just encourage people to reach out to their legislators and ask, simple questions. Where do you stand on this? Or how can I get more information about that? And if you're trying to find your legislator, I know that there was a link posted in the chat to the Senate's website where there's a little widget where you can put in your address and they'll tell you who your senator is. There's a similar one for the House of Representatives, but also the Secretary of State's website has a really simple widget. So if you go on Google and say, who's my legislator in Michigan, those kinds of links will pop up, and hopefully they'll be easy for folks to use. And if they're not, anybody can call my office and we'll do our best to direct people in the right direction.
Thank you.
TC, you can go ahead.
Okay, I have a question, and it's about for nonprofits itself. For a nonprofit to miss the deadline to file for taxes and they go into revocation, why is it so hard for the IRS to respond back to have it lapse? And I know that may not be your question, but it takes 10 months to get an answer from the IRS when it could have been just resolved a long time ago. So I don't understand why the IRS, how to expedite to get help from the IRS for nonprofits. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. So, the first answer is I don't really know. I've been involved in nonprofits. I've started them before in the past. The paperwork can sometimes be challenging, and so I appreciate the challenge. I don't know why it takes them so long. I don't have a good answer for that, but I will sort of punt a little bit officially to say that the IRS is a federal agency. And if you write my office about the IRS, we'll do our best to kind of hold your hand to that process. But the first thing we're probably going to do is pass you off to our very capable Congresswoman's office, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. They're going to be in a much better position to answer that question and to reach out to IRS individually and say, hey, I've got a constituent who has a problem with your agency. Can you help me work with them? Same would go for our US senators. So our federal representatives are really our best bridge to those federal agencies. And that's the best I can do on that question.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I don't see any more hand raised. Gail, do you have another question?
No, I was waiting for your question.
Oh, I was just gonna ask Jeff if he could explain the process or how you could request a legislative tribute.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, there's all sorts of other things that we do in the legislature. I'm focused on, I don't know, I can be sometimes very practical, what's passing. But one of the things that we get to do that's very cool is we get to, give tributes from the legislature, honoring the great work of some person or, some organization. And so if you know somebody in the community who you think really ought to be honored because they've done something great, maybe some milestone, maybe some, great accomplishment, that's the sort of thing where your legislator, so that in this case, it could be myself or it could be your state representative, could, write up a little tribute, and get the governor and your legislator hopefully to sign that saying, look, we recognize that you've done something good in our state. You've made our state a little better or a lot better, and we appreciate it. And so, if you're interested in having someone or an organization that get that kind of tribute, sometimes or it's like a new business in the community or a longtime business in the community, those kinds of things are cool things to recognize. And it's a nice opportunity that we have as legislators to request that kind of thing. Legislators also have the opportunity to request opinions from the Attorney General. We have to be a little bit careful how we use that because we don't want them to get annoyed by a constant request. But, for instance, during the height of the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of local governments who were saying, look, the law doesn't clearly allow us to meet on Zoom, but, what if we've got somebody who's especially susceptible, someone who's vulnerable, who's not ready to come back into a meeting? What if we've got someone who's in cancer treatment, who's not ready to expose themselves potentially to this disease? Maybe there should be some allowances. And so we actually reached out to the Attorney General's office and said, look, we think maybe the Americans with Disabilities Act should cover these kinds of situations, and the state's laws around making accommodations for people should cover these kinds of situations. And the Attorney General issued an opinion saying, yes, the Open Meetings Act does require accommodations for disability. And so that allowed people to continue to participate in important ways, despite their unwillingness or desire to not show up at public meetings. And this isn't just city councils and township boards. We've got all sorts of individuals in the community who volunteer for important boards in the community, whether that's the Parks Commission or the Transit Board or the Downtown Development Authority, or all these kinds of things that are important to the functioning of our communities. And that's another opportunity we have to make sure that our laws are being properly obeyed and properly servicing the needs of the people.
Thank you. Oh. PC?
I have a opportunity to work with monarch butterflies and the migration of monarch butterflies. Is there an opportunity that we can, the community itself or the legislator can talk about the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly and the monarch butterfly itself to at least get more education out to the communities about these two butterflies, and at least connect this with MDOT, so that way butterfly bushes can be planted on the embankments of the expressway, so that way it can help the journey and the migration of these animals going throughout the communities.
Yeah, and it'd be something that we'd be happy to work with you on. There is a sort of like pollinator promotion program that the state started a few years ago. I don't know everything about exactly how it functions or exactly what it calls for, but that would be the sort of thing that we could work with you to ask MDOT, ask MDARD, Michigan Department of Agricultural and Rural Development. What are they doing about that? A lot of the work that my office has been doing around these issues has been more focused on trying to reduce the chemical load and trying to reduce the chemicals that we put into the environment that injure or prevent the pollinators from either living or coming here. And we'd be happy to talk to you more about what can we do around buffer crops, around like you suggested, things around the highways that might be advantageous to continuing that migration and continuing the benefit that these pollinators provide for our state on their way to Mexico and back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I would like to say thank you so much, Senator Jeff Irwin. I am eternally grateful for all of the knowledge that you have provided me, which allowed other people to have the knowledge as well. Your door is always open, and with great kindness from all of your staff. So I appreciate you and your staff for always being willing to participate in events like this with Ipsy Can I Share. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Gail. And I don't want to steal the last word, but I do want to also thank you for all the work you do. I really appreciate how you're comfortable reaching out and helping me see things in the community. And I would just encourage, everybody out there who's listening, who might listen to this video all the way to the end, to do the same. Your legislators want to hear from you. And if they don't want to hear from you, they ought to be replaced. And so the kind of work that citizens can do working together with their legislators can be, very impactful. One of the, stories I would tell is when, Gail reached out to me early on in the COVID pandemic and said, look, these vaccines aren't getting to Ypsilanti in ways that they need to. And because of, messages like that coming forward and the work that we were able to do together, the state created a special program to make sure that communities of color who were getting left behind because of various reasons, got some special attention and got more community-based distribution. And, there's a lot of mistakes that were made in the rollout of those vaccines and a lot of lessons to be learned. But one of the lessons I learned was that, having our ear to the ground and having an open mind and an open ear to the messages from the community is powerful and important.
Thank you. And thank you, Annie, for always assisting. We appreciate you as well. Thank you. And good night, everyone.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.